And now the tables turn, and it is Firouzja that begins the attack with this move, c4. Welcome to Chess Dog, I'm John, and today we are at the Sinkfield Cup with Alireza Firouzja going up against Wesley So, and this game is a very exciting roller coaster of a game. Let's jump right in. Alireza Firouzja has the white pieces, Wesley So has black. Let's take a look. Alireza begins with e4, Wesley So responds with e5, and we get the Italian game, which is very common at the highest levels these days. Knight f6, castles d6, c3, castles h3, h6. Of course, they want to keep some control over these squares. Rook to e1 to add to the defense of e4, and a6. This gives black the opportunity to tuck that bishop back on a7. So Wesley So plays a6. Firouzja plays a4. He does the same thing, but gains a little bit more space. And Wesley So says, you know what, I want that space too. So he responds with a5. Firouzja plays knight b to d2. Of course, the traditional idea of going knight f1, knight g3 is being prepared. And bishop to e6 is played by black, immediately challenging Alireza Firouzja's bishop on c4. Instead of exchanging it off, what Firouzja does is play b3. And black does not want to take the bishop because if this pawn were to recapture, Alireza Firouzja would have a lot of pawns in the middle of the board. He doesn't want, and Wesley So doesn't want to give him that kind of control of the center. So b3 defends that bishop. Rook to e8. And here, Alireza Firouzja plays a very interesting and controversial novelty. He plays the move bishop to b2. Now, you're not supposed to play that move in this position. Every Russian schoolboy knows that, as the old saying goes. The problem with the move is that it leaves this bishop on c5 uncontested, aiming at f2, and also it no longer controls the f4 square, so Wesley So could play knight h5, knight f4, and get a very comfortable position. So black has an easier game because of this. Having said that, if the center were to open up, the bishop on b2 could, in the long run, become powerful. But in the short term, it's a strange choice from Firouzja, but he's always playing creative chess. Let's see how it works out. Wesley So counterattacks in the center. He plays d5. Bishop to b5 is played, pinning the knight on c6 and undermining this pawn on e5 by pinning the pawn's key defender. So Wesley So takes twice on e4, and here he plays knight to h5. And looking at this game, and the commentators during the game said this, black has a lot of easy moves. And this is a big deal, particularly at the highest levels of the game. How easy is your play? Like, it's not what a computer says. It's, do I have a lot of moves that I can make that are easy? They don't have to think much about. And Wesley So has that here against Firouzja. The queen can go to f6 and then shift over to g6. The knight goes h5, f4. The bishop, of course, is still putting the pressure on this diagonal. So to normal eyes, Wesley So looks to have a very nice position here, and mainly because this bishop went to b2. Knight to c4 was played. Now, computers show that the move bishop to a3, immediately challenging this bishop on c5, is probably the best after exchanging. This rook is a little bit out of play, but getting rid of that powerful bishop would have been worth it. But instead, Firouzja plays knight to c4, piling up on the e5 pawn. Queen to f6 defends the pawn, but also helps control the f4 square that Wesley So's knight could jump into. Also, there's the shift to g6 that could come later. And Firouzja captures on c6. Bishop takes c6, pawn takes back, and he has voluntarily given Wesley So the two bishops, and that is quite a bit of a concession. In exchange, he's created a lot of weak pawns on the queen side, but Wesley So is saying, well, yeah, that's true, but my play is on the king side, so I'm not too concerned about those pawns. Knight c to e5, Firouzja grabs that pawn in the center, and now bishop to h3, exclamation point. Wesley So far playing very strong chess, and here Firouzja cannot take the bishop. If he takes, then here rook takes e5 would be played, and if he recaptures the rook, that actually leads to mate, because a queen to f2 check, and after king h1, knight to g3 would be mate. The best option here would be c4, but now we begin to see this bishop open up along the long diagonal, but it isn't enough. After queen to g6 check, king moves, now rook takes e4, and exchanging on e4. And in this position, with a safer king and an extra pawn, Wesley So would clearly be better. So Firouzja plays knight to d3, hitting this bishop on c5, which is a very powerful piece. And Wesley So plays queen to g6. He could have played rook a to d8, pinning that knight. That was one of his options. But instead he plays queen to g6 with the not-so-subtle threat of queen takes g2 mate. And Firouzja basically has an only move here. He has to play knight to h4. It hits the queen, but the main idea is that it defends the g2 point and defends against the mate. And interestingly, as easy as black's play is, the computer never goes crazy for black. It sees this as kind of equal, but to human eyes, black has just been better the whole way up to this point. And Wesley So plays queen to g5, which does hit the knight on h4 and also defends this bishop on c5, which Firouzja now captures, and he's eliminated a very important bishop in black's position. Queen takes knight at h4, and now pawn takes bishop. Here, queen to g5 was played, a check, was played by Wesley So. He could have played rook to e5 also, hitting the knight and threatening to shift over to the g5 square. But queen to g5 check, which of course attacks the king and the knight simultaneously. Queen goes to g4, and now queen takes c5. But through all of these complications, black's attack has sort of withered away. And now the tables turn, and it is Firouzja that begins the attack with this move, c4. And look at this bishop on b2. Who's laughing now, huh? That move so questionable earlier in the game, well, now the bishop is a beast. And this knight at h5 is over here on the side of the board, and Firouzja can be very happy with this position. He's the one pressing for the attack now. Rook a to b8. He could have played queen to g5, Wesley So, and kept things sort of equal. But he plays rook a to b8, threatening this pawn at b3. And here, Firouzja plays e5. What he's doing is interfering with the queen's defense of the knight. The queen defended the knight laterally, but now this pawn interferes with that. And also this pawn can cause some problems by advancing to e6 later. Now here, the strongest move for black would have been rook takes b3. And he's actually would be threatening rook to g3 check with a double attack on the queen and the king. The pawn could not take the rook because of the pin. And so bishop to d4 to get rid of that pin and attack the queen. Queen takes pawn, bishop b3, queen takes, and then after a few exchanges, you'd have a very complicated endgame where black would have 4 pawns for the bishop, but some of those pawns would be weak, and I don't know what the result would be in a situation like that. But instead, Wesley So plays g6. After having the tables turn on him, he makes a mistake. This weakens his king a little too much. And in this position, as I was actually watching the game live, the computer gives a winning move for white. There's only one winning move. And everybody that was in the chat was saying, oh, it's an easy move to find. Of course, they were looking at the computers. I didn't think it was an easy move at all. And we waited to see if Alireza would find the move. And he did find the move. The move is bishop to a3, kicking this queen away. Now, he could play e6 immediately. But if he does that, opening up the diagonal and attacking the king's structure, rook to b3, and he's still, Wesley So would still be threatening this rook to g3 check business. After pawn takes, king takes, computers say this is equal. Obviously, it's very unbalanced. But playing bishop a3 first kicks the queen away. And now all those variations after queen to b6 work really well for white. They're dominating. Now e6 is much more powerful. And the threat, by the way, is white would take on f7, and now white would just be winning. And if, of course, this is black didn't move in this variation, but king f7, rook e8, queen to d7 check, and the rook cannot interpose because the bishop at a3 controls that square, and after king g8, queen e8, obviously the game would be over. So that's the threat that Firouzja has after e6. To stop that, Wesley So plays c5. He wants to block this bishop's access to the e7 square like we just saw in that variation. Pawn takes, king takes, queen to d7 check. The king goes to f8. And it would be a mistake here to play queen to h7, because after knight, queen g6, Firouzja would still be better, but black can still play on. And instead, Firouzja plays the more accurate move, queen to d5, hitting this pawn twice, and Wesley So is in big trouble. King to g7, bishop takes pawn, hits the queen, and also threatens queen to d7 check. Knight to f6, and now just bishop b6. He lets queens come off the board, but after rook takes rook, rook takes rook, bishop takes a5. This is an easily winning endgame with an extra pawn and a passed pawn over here, and the better minor piece. In fact, after rook to e8, Wesley So resigned in this position. An amazing comeback from Firouzja. And even going over this great game from Firouzja, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. And to fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to see is this game right here. So be sure to check that video out for some more mind-blowing chess.